We wanted to air a correction. We covered a story yesterday on a recent Twitter Files drop, that was Twitter Files 20, that exposed how journalists, academics, intelligence operatives, military and government personnel aligned to censor and curb freedom of expression. Now, we mistakenly mischaracterized the author of that drop, Andrew Lowenthal, saying that he was in bad standing with the NGO Engage Media, where he served as executive director for 18 years. We want to be clear that he is in good standing. He was not he was not lobbing accusations specifically at that NGO. As we mentioned, Andrew Lowenthal served as executive director for Engage Media, and it's devoted to digital rights and freedoms. He took to his Twitter account Network Effects to reveal what he discovered via the Twitter Files access, like a $1 billion contract the Department of Defense had awarded to counter misinformation, and the partnership of big names, including Madeleine Albright, executives of software companies like Microsoft, media outlets, social media giants, and a slew of others.
Part of his expose included how an effort was waged to sift through COVID-19 related misinformation, and the people involved boasted about collecting 11 billion tweets and over 100 terabytes of social media data since 2020 that they deemed mis and disinformation research activity. Here's our reaction to this story from yesterday.
A new round of the Twitter Files exposes how journalists, academics, intelligence operatives, military and government personnel aligned to censor and curb freedom of expression. Andrew Lowenthal served as executive director for NGO Engage Media that supposedly was devoted to digital rights and freedoms, but he says that throughout his 18-year tenure, he discovered it did anything but. And he took to his Twitter account Network Effects to reveal what's been kept under wraps, like a $1 billion contract the Department of Defense awarded to counter misinformation, and also the partnership of big names, including Madeleine Albright, executives of software companies like Microsoft, media outlets, social media giants, and a slew of others.
Part of his expose included how an effort was waged to sift through COVID-19 related misinformation, and the people involved boasted about collecting 11 billion tweets and over 100 terabytes of social media data since 2020 that they deemed mis and disinformation research activity. What do you make of this, Robbie?
So this is a lot more of, what we've been seeing throughout the Twitter Files, a very, nebulous web of some explicit law enforcement or law enforcement partnership agencies, social media content moderations, media organizations, and a bunch of NGOs and some academic organizations like Stanford coming together, having a lot of conversations on email chains, on calls about how to handle, first election-related misinformation, Russian influence stuff, and then ultimately a lot of COVID stuff, what they should do. A lot of content being flagged for deletion, being suggested to the content moderators at Twitter, like, you should do something about this. It's wrong. It's dangerous. It's everywhere. In a direction that is very ideological and I think not necessarily beneficial to the discourse. Like I'm seeing, so in this specific disclosure, it's mentioning the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is, I believe, a British nonprofit that I've tangled with before, and yeah, they're flagging. So they're in here, sending emails to Twitter moderators saying, hey, please find an attached list of pages and groups, accounts, channels we identified as forming the anti-vax industry online in our recent report. We say that this has grown to 58 million. The following for these groups is 58 million. They are promoting distrust in official media advice. How dare they? They seek to persuade your users to take dangerous actions based on misinformation, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. This center, I remember, because they said they flagged a bunch of right-wing websites as like so dangerous because their numbers were like, I forget exactly what the statistic was. It was like they were claiming that 70% of all bad content on Facebook has to do with just a couple conservative sites, and Facebook read the report and was like, this is BS, this isn't true. So again, the people charged with gatekeeping, who are like, we're on top of misinformation, we're going to police it, they can be clumsy too. I'm sure some of the things they flagged were very bad and things that Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, would have and should have and ought to have taken action against under their own policies. But it's still a little, more than a little disturbing to me, the level of coordination that was going on behind the scenes between all these different, very ideologically motivated interest groups.
I guess I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, to the extent the Twitter Files, generally speaking, not this particular report, point to a very substantial coercion or persuasion campaign from government agencies like the FBI to encourage them to take down information which was not only very material to the outcome of the 2020 election, but which was also true. And to the extent that the FBI, government agencies, put so much pressure, because there was such trust in these agencies and because of how heavily they leaned on Twitter, for Twitter to take actions that affected the outcome of politics inappropriately and silenced a story that had journalistic legitimacy, that is obviously a significant problem. But I will say that some of the reports that are now coming out and that have come out since some of the initial Twitter Files disclosures have the air of, did you know that NGOs were bad? Did you know that a lot of NGOs were funded by interest groups that don't necessarily have your interests at heart, that they are political, that they are neoliberal, that they, and, maybe people don't know. And maybe they thought that NGOs were just benevolent and truly searching for speech and goodness and all of that. And so these reports are useful to them, but the kind of bombshell framing of some of it I find to be less persuasive, because it's not especially shocking to me that interest groups have interests and they lobby tech companies in advance of their interests. It's a lot less pernicious from my perspective than, let's say, the FBI. Now, I would also say that a lot of the story and some of the pushback that some parts that Twitter Files have received is that Twitter, Facebook, and the example that you just mentioned were under all of that pressure, but ultimately declined to act on it. So then the story becomes non-government group, NGO, tries to get Twitter to do something and Twitter doesn't, which starts to feel a little bit like a non-story and a generalized complaint about the existence of interest groups that don't share my interests. And while there is a substantive conversation to be had about lobbying dollars and the extent to which some of these NGOs might get funding from sources that we should have complaints about, and what mechanisms are in place at institutions like Twitter and Facebook to make sure they don't fall for things like the Hunter Biden story suppression in the future, the sum of the framing of this seems to me to be feeding into a conspiratorial mindset that's not very action-oriented and geared toward making modifications to protect the public and free speech, and more to creating this idea that there are particularly left-leaning free speech vampires out there that are out to get you. There's a weird reference to FBI people who also have they, them in their pronouns. I don't know what that has to do with anything. So I'm inclined to be sensitive to, yes, speech shouldn't be restrained. The FBI story was a mistake, but there's like diminishing returns on some of this reporting for me at this point.
What I am most struck by with each subsequent revelation is, you're right, the jaw on the floor stuff, we're a little bit past that now, but how big this club is that you're not in, that we're not in.
Absolutely, that's true.
The club has in it the social media moderators, a lot of people in government, a lot of people in NGOs, a lot of academics, and a lot of people in the media. I mean, on these emails, and again, the content of these emails in many cases is benign, but they are routinely all talking about content moderation and misinformation, and they all includes the editors of magazines like Rolling Stone in here, New York Times people, Washington Post people. They all got together at Aspen and like war gamed what a hack and leak operation would look like from the standpoint of the hack and leak operation being false. And then an actual one happened, and they all thought it was going to be false, the Hunter Biden's laptop, but it was true. And that's interesting. Even you're right. You don't turn into a conspiracy thing, but the amount of coordination between all of these entities, and again, this doesn't actually make me hostile to Twitter and Facebook. It makes me more sympathetic to their plight, because they're in this room just being bombarded with the same message over and over again from all these forces, and knowing if they don't do what they're being pressed to do, then there's going to be, as there was frequently, negative articles about the companies in those magazines and newspapers about how they're not taking the threat of Russian disinformation seriously enough. That's what we saw with that Hamilton 68 list over and over again. Here's the list of Russian bots that Twitter knows about and they're not doing anything about.
Yeah.
That was all made, that was not true.
Yeah.
That's my concern.
And I hate that concern.
Yeah.
And look, if it is news, I don't mean to diminish it, but people should absolutely know that all these folks went off to elite institutions. Half of them are Harvard.edu addresses, and they all are still friends, and they talk about each other. They talk to each other, and they have class interests that aren't yours. If that's news, let's let it be news. And it's definitely important and salient for a lot of issues that are about why our political system never attends to the interests of working people. But that is an issue, broadly speaking, and that's not to minimize that it should be a concern, but it's 100% true that everybody went off to elite institutions, which they're now gatekeeping from you because they don't want you and your children to have access to them. And they have lifelong relationships where they are able to do each other's favors and curry influence with each other for the rest of their lives. That is 100% factually true.
Yeah. Incredible to see it, though, laid bare like this.
Sure.
To some degree. More Rising right after this.